In this video, I'd like to talk about creating the illusion of depth in your paintings by consciously applying a few different principles and techniques that I'm going to talk about. Now, these principles are overlap, atmospheric and aerial perspective, value range, and scale in linear perspective. I'm going to break this down a little bit more, but in every piece that I do, I specifically and consciously try and apply these principles. Just knowing about the principles and thinking about them is all well and good, but without that direct conscious effort in its application, it's like trying to hit a target blindfolded, knowing only the general direction of the target. So I'm hoping making it clear will help you take this blindfold off when you're thinking about creating depth in your images. So let's get started. And the first thing is overlap. So this is as simple as it sounds, and it's literally the placement of shapes in front of other shapes so that they obscure them to some degree. It's probably the strongest indicator of depth, and in general, the more value contrast there is between a shape and the shapes behind it, so the more lighter or darker something is than what is behind it, the more heightened that sense of overlap and depth. And I've got a couple of examples. This painting by Eric Kipp, you can clearly see. Oops, let's just get there right. All right, so in this image, you can clearly see that the boat and this figure overlaps the boat behind it. And that boat, in turn, overlaps or cuts across the boat behind it. And these cues are very effective in showing the depth. It's not value alone that is doing this, it's also that sense of cutting or being in front of other shapes. So let's take another quick example. This is by Craig Mullins, and again you'll see he very obviously uses overlap to create that separation between the objects and the background. He does this in many places, and it's a hierarchy of overlap. So these figures are all in front of the general background. In this area here, you can see that these pots and these figures are in front of whatever is happening behind it here, in front of the smoke, and in turn, the smoke overlaps this figure here. So we're constantly creating the sense of depth by using this overlap. And this is where tangents come in. Tangents are basically when you've got two objects at different depths, and some edges of them basically intersect. They touch each other, and that breaks the sensation of depth because, well, there's no overlap. And because overlap is so strong, if it's not there, and there's no other cues like value or contrast to suggest that depth, it can often override everything else. So tangents are something to watch out for, and the way to think about that is make sure that your objects always overlap things in front of it to make it especially clear. You can be subtle with it, but you have to be conscious with it. Okay, so the next, we can extend this idea of overlap by talking about dark versus light rhythms. So in order to show this overlap and to show depth, we can think of repeating layers of overlap, and by creating dark against light rhythms. Repeating dark against light rhythms can very quickly create a feeling of depth. So let's have a look at some of these examples. So this is an image by Joseph McGurl, and you can clearly see in the reeds that what he's done is use dark versus light. So there's dark in this area here, and in the bottom of the reeds, and then there's light. There's dark, And then there's light. There's a dark area and a light area, a dark area and a light area, a dark area and a light area. And it just keeps going and going. We can see it in the rest of the image. Dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. Basically, it just keeps on going. And it's this repeated rhythmic pattern which we see all around us in nature, which is a natural feature of overlap. And is very, very easy thing to use in order to create some sensation of depth. So another thing that we can think about when talking about overlap is counterchange. Now, counterchange is basically the changing of a tonal relationship between an object and its background. I mean, that gobbledygook basically means that an object changes from darker to lighter throughout it, and the opposite happens in whatever is behind it. And this will be much easier to understand with some examples. So here's a Bierstadt painting. If we look at this painting, and let's have a look at this statue here. You'll notice at the base of the statue it's quite dark, and as we move up the statue it gets light. And it's light over here, and then as it moves up, further up the statue, it gets dark again. So we've again got this idea of dark to light to dark. And that's all throughout this object. But let's now have a look at what's happening in the background behind it. In this light area, whatever is around it is dark. In this dark area of the object, whatever is behind it is lighter than it. So you can see that this is basically counterchange, and you can see how effective it is in using value and using overlap to really enhance that sensation of depth, depending on what your piece needs. And you can actually use these like little engineering tools almost to figure out what and where value should go to in order to accentuate what you need. So another quick couple of examples. Counterchange. Theo Prins, again in these columns, you can see throughout the column he goes from light to slightly lighter to darker, 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 and then dark. And in the background you can see it's mostly darker at the bottom, and when he goes up there, the background gets lighter. So, counterchange, things swap their tonal relationships. Very effective way of creating depth in one area, just by changing those tonal relationships. Okay, next one, Jeremy Lipking. Fantastic painting, I love this. So let's look at counterchange in this hill area. You have a light plane, a relatively darker hill, which transitions to a lighter area of the range of the massif, and then once we get past the rim, this cloud is dark. So the contrast is pretty clear. And again, I mean, if you look at this image with overlap, we've got light and dark and light and dark, and then light and then within these images and within the mountain ranges themselves, you can see bands of dark and light. So this may have been present in whatever he was looking at, but also it's very clear that he's used dark and light and rhythms to create a powerful image. Alright, let's talk about the next thing, which is, let's get rid of that, atmospheric or aerial perspective. I expect most of you would know what this is, but atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective is basically how the amount of atmosphere that exists between the viewer and an object affects the appearance of that object. Generally speaking, the further away something is, the more atmosphere there is in the way, I guess, unless you're in space. this effect of atmospheric perspective can change greatly depending on many factors, including the weather, the time of day, the particulates in the air, such as smoke or smog, mist. And there are a couple of very simple rules that affect how atmospheric perspective affects objects. And these are: the further away from the viewer something is, the less value contrast there is between that object's darkest and lightest areas. And also, the further away from the viewer something is, the more the local color of that object shifts towards the color of the atmosphere. And as a byproduct of lower contrast, the objects that are further away also often appear fuzzier and have more indistinct edges than you would normally see. And this is due to the reduced ability of our eyes to resolve detail in low contrast situations. So let's just sum that up really quickly with a couple of examples. So here's a photograph. It clearly demonstrates atmospheric perspective. And so, starting up in the foreground, we have these hills. And they're greens and yellows and, relatively, you can see blades of grass, relatively high in contrast. And the further each hill away that we go, with each step, you'll see that the color changes and shifts. It goes from the greeny yellows to the slightly more, less greeny colors, to more blue-green, again, more blue-green, less contrast. The shapes start to become very indistinct. This is pretty much going to blue, and then with each step, with each receding depth, the contrast is lowered, the atmosphere has affected the actual color of what the objects are, so this blue atmosphere is affecting the color that we see from green to blue, and also the edges are a little bit fuzzier than closer up because there's not that much contrast in them. So that's basically atmospheric perspective. So let's look at a painted example. This is by Albert Bierstadt. Again, it's fairly obvious. Closer in, you'll see, let's have a look at these trees. You'll see they're very dark, high in contrast, and green. The further away you go, they start to get lighter, less in contrast, and slightly less green. And the next step, very much reducing contrast. The greens are starting to get lighter, a little bit more bluer, and then the further away you get, things just, become more and more blue. So it's the same principle at work. Eric Kipps, this is a great example of atmospheric perspective. So as well as overlap, he's used the lowering of contrast between these areas in order to create different sensations of depth. So this front area has way more contrast than anything else. The contrast steps down. Notice the value is still dark, so normally you tend to think of things getting lighter as they go away, but the value is still quite dark. But the reduction of contrast in this area really helps drive that sense of depth. Again, value and contrast comes down, and the color shifts towards the color of the environment, and it just goes on. So, and you can see how great the sensation of depth is here. All right, so let's talk about value range, and by that I mean the value arrangement in your piece. We generally tend to think that we start light in the back and you get darker up front, because that's pretty much the way atmospheric perspective works. But is this always the case? Do we always have to be light in the back, dark up front? Well, let's have a look. 99% of the time, you will actually see this being used in environment work. It'll always be lighter in the background, getting darker, more contrast to darkest with, you know, sometimes the highest amount of contrast, sometimes not, but generally darker in value. And this is so used that it's almost ubiquitous everywhere, and it's a rule that you can definitely use and it will work. So yeah, totally light in the back and darker up front will help give you that sensation of depth. But let's have a look at some other examples. Well, this one's different. This is Maciej Kuchara's Last of Us. Look at this. The background is actually the mid-range values. Right? The midground are actually the darker values. And the foreground are the lighter values. And the other thing that you'll notice, so this is slightly a different value arrangement. The other thing you'll notice is that in the midground, he's got the highest contrast areas. So it's not necessarily, even though contrast brings things forward due to atmospheric perspective, less atmospheric perspective, he's actually created higher contrast areas in the mid-range where he wants the focus to be. Very high contrast. So, yeah, you can play with your value arrangements. You don't have to always go from light to dark up front. Light in the back, dark up front. You can switch it up and experiment. Another one, Theoprins, again, another example of mostly dark up in the back, you know, and then there's light areas in the midground, and then mid-range in the front, so slightly different. This one is actually a little bit more complex because there's more going on. But another thing you'll notice is, look at this, it's light to dark, you know, light, dark, dark. So, yeah, these are things to be very, very conscious of. Okay, and the last thing that we can talk about in creating depth is scale in linear perspective. Now, that's basically just how big the objects in our scene are depending on the perspective and the depth. So the way linear perspective works is very intuitive. So obviously things of equal size appear smaller the further away they are from the viewer. We can also use easily recognizable shapes, such as people or lampposts or vehicles, in contrast to other things in the scene, in order to imply their scale. This is why we have those tropes of the walking stick salesman, the guy with a stick, maybe with a light on it, standing there looking out at a vista, or the flock of birds in the distance. These are all scale cues. But so they're very useful, and that's why they're always used. But because they're so powerful scale cues, these recognizable objects, we also have to be careful to use them in ways that don't break the scale that we're trying to show. So, for example, if you put a giant that is 10 meters tall in a totally flat... let's just do this, because I feel like painting something and not talking. If we have a giant in a totally flat plane, standing there, minding his own business, being friendly, well, how do we actually know he's a giant? We don't, really. If you just put a car next to him, well, he's not a giant anymore. This is terrible 2-year-old drawings. Actually, it's kind of fun and freeing. Yeah, so definitely not a giant. But let's put something like buildings. Maybe a bridge. Maybe some little birds. And maybe some mountains in the background. And all of a sudden, you know, BFG, Big Friendly Giant, ain't so friendly anymore. So it's very important to be mindful of your scale cues. And let's look at some examples of this being used. This is John Atkinson Grimshaw. Again, recognizable objects, the people. And watch how the people get smaller as they go into the distance. Lampposts. Lampposts are this big. They recede into the distance. We assume they're the same because they look the same. They get smaller. Horses and carriages, these are recognizable. Silhouettes of buildings, recognizable. And we assume these are really far in the distance. Also, the atmospheric perspective helps that. So it's all these things in concert together working in this piece. This is by Zdzisław Beksiński. He's an amazing Polish painter. And yeah, so scale. Let's look at scale closer up. We get the sense that these are gravestones, you know, half human height perhaps. And then the further away you get, the repeated shapes, but getting smaller, recognizable, helps us to understand what is going on in this piece, how far the distances are. And again, what is this? Well, it looks kind of like a building to me. And the size of it in the distance and the atmospheric perspective all go together to create sensations of depth. And last one. This is again by Grimshaw, who I think really does use his cues and his atmospheric perspective really well. So it's the same thing. You can see these buildings are, the windows are getting smaller as they go into the distance. The people are getting smaller. The row of shop lights get all smaller. And very obvious one, the masts of the ship. Very, very, very clear what the scale is. Right, so that basically covers the main things that go to help create depth. And you should definitely be thinking about using these in your paintings very, very specifically. And if something doesn't feel right, if something is broken, maybe examine your piece using these 4 things as filters. Look at overlaps, look at tangents, look at your atmospheric perspective, look at the value range that you have and whether that's working, and look at whether your scale cues are right. And all these things together will come together to create awesome depth in your pieces. So thanks a lot. I hope that was informative for you. I know it's not a lot of painting, but there's going to be a demo coming up that accompanies this pretty soon. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys.